I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. The film I'm going to discuss today will involve me having to discuss things like misogyny, homophobia, and sexual violence. If that's not something you feel like you can listen to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this one. Hello, my name is Amber. This is You Look Like a Badger, a podcast where I discuss queer cinema. This is officially the first episode of season 4 of the podcast. It's technically the second podcast episode of the year. If you missed my episode on David Lynch, then you should go back and listen to that, because that was an interesting one to record, I think. But yes, if you listened to the season 4 trailer at all, you will know that this year I have decided to dedicate my time to watching some of the worst LGBT movies of all time. Why did I do this? I needed some tension, I think. Something to distract myself, something to direct my attention to. And I think this is a good it's as good a time as any to watch some horrible movies. With that in mind, the first episode of this season is going to be dedicated to Lesbian Vampire Killers.
Centuries ago, during the dawn of the red moon, our peaceful hamlet was terrorized by a beast. Born not of man, but spewed forth from the fieriest pits of Hades, with an evil fueled by a hatred of men and a love of women. Its name, Carmilla, the Vampire Queen. No one could defeat her save one man, a baron, away for decades fighting in the Crusades. Upon his return, the Baron found that Carmilla's desires had ensnared his beautiful wife, Eva, and turned her into a lover of the Virgin. Consumed with vengeance, the Baron pledged to destroy Carmilla and flee the village. Without fear, he confronted Carmilla. Before the Baron could strike the fatal blow, Carmilla laid down a curse most vile.
As you strike me down, so you shall release the evil within me to your daughters, and your daughters' daughters, and they shall not rest until your bloodline is ended. They will know your breed by these marks above your heart. And when the life's blood of the last of your line mixes with that of a virgin girl, I shall rise again, more powerful than you will ever imagine.
And with that, he lopped her fucking head off. Henceforth, every woman in our village, upon her 18th birthday, is turned by the curse and reborn a lesbian vampire. Our only salvation is a prophecy that foretells of the day when the last descendant of the Baron's bloodline shall return to this hamlet and vanquish Carmilla's curse forever.
Lesbian Vampire Killers is a 2009 horror comedy directed by Phil Claydon and starring James Corden and Matthew Horn. It follows Jimmy and Fletcher after their rejection from the various women in their lives as they arrive in the British countryside attempting to have a lad's holiday. Instead, they are descended upon by gay vampires who want to resurrect their leader, Carmilla, and spread vampirism to the female population. They take it upon themselves to defeat this curse, riffing on 70s hammer horror that was similarly invested in maintaining the heterosexuality of its women with the twist of self-awareness slapped on top. Described at the time as an instantly forgettable lads mag farce and a tragically feeble spoof, it's a film that fails to deconstruct the homophobia and misogyny of the vampire horror film, and in fact derives most of its comedy through gesturing at tropes of the genre with genuinely pitiful results. It also commits the worst sin a bad movie can commit by being really, really boring. Now, despite this introduction, it was, in fact, nominated for awards and did win awards, so I'll add this section in now. So it won the San Sebastian Horror Film Festival Audience Award for Best Feature Film, and Debbie Wiseman was nominated by the International Film Music Critics Association for Best Original Score for a comedy film. So that is nice for her, I guess. On Rotten Tomatoes, it has a 28% critic score and a 32% audience score. And on Letterboxd, it has a 2. I am eager but also tentative to get into these Letterboxd reviews. So if you haven't listened to an episode of this podcast before, I will go to Letterboxd and just pull the most popular reviews from the site. Now what you're going to find if you go to this movie is a lot of people talking about James Corden, because since this movie came out, he has become a more significant public figure and also a figure of ridicule and hatred. So whether warranted or not, he has become the intense focus of most of people's hatred for this film. I assume people who are American and have had to enjoy him being a talk show host for a significant portion of time. Whereas I think most of the hatred towards this film, when it first came out, will have come from British critics, British audiences who were fans of Gavin and Stacey and maybe knew him from that and expected more from him. I do think that I'm going to end up talking a little bit about James Corden's public image and how he has responded to this film. It is quite interesting the way that he has kind of become the focus of what is terrible about this film. And if I'm being completely honest, he isn't actually the worst part of it. That is not me defending the film, because it is still very, very bad. But his character did actually get some laughs out of me, so we'll get into what doesn't work here. My genuine opinion, if you want it, is that this was a poorly conceived film and shouldn't have existed in the first place. Enough detraction, let's look at these reviews. Gus Van Rant on Letterboxd says, "We are the daughters of the lesbian vampires James Corden couldn't kill." This next review is from Beck, who says, "This is the most lesbophobic shit I've ever seen. Also, James Corden owes me $1 million for saying dyke." I am genuinely kind of baffled at what was able to pass during this time, because I feel like saying slurs to offend people is incredibly childish, but like it's also coming from a quite childish period of British comedy history. So if you think like Little Britain, Bow Selector, Phone Jacker, the Ali G show, stuff like that, where like pushing people's buttons deliberately is a way to like get a rise out of them. Meanwhile, you're doing like bottom of the barrel stuff and you're saying slurs because you think it's funny to say slurs. It's a lot. We'll get to it. And this last review from Raymundo R says, "The writers really thought James Corden lobbing holy water condom balloons would be enough for the audience to get past the flagrant misogyny abound. And yet." A spoiler-free opinion is that I've watched plenty of horror films that pathologize their own misogyny, or they make the misogyny like the centerpiece of it. And it's not that I haven't been like, oh great, another one of these, but I do feel as though whilst it is worth being critical of, and we are going to be, don't worry, I find the incompetence of the film kind of more offensive. For example, if it was a better written film, or it looked nicer, if I believed that everyone on set wanted to be there, I feel as though I may be less harsh on it, and possibly other people might be as well. So an example is that I watched With Nell and I a few weeks ago, kind of as preparation for this film, because people had like compared them in the sense that it's two friends, in quotes, at odds with one another, and they are swept away to a country holiday because they can't bear their lives. And I would argue that that film is as homophobic as this one, but people think of it more fondly because the writing is quite sharp and the acting is very good, and the general energy of it is something that will keep the audience awake. Whereas for me, when I was watching this film, my eyes started to glaze over like 40 minutes in. And that is a big problem when you are both a horror and a comedy, both of which kind of rely on the audience participation in the film, as in you either want them to be scared or freaked out or genuinely unnerved by what's going on, or you want them to be really laughing. And I fear that the only people who would laugh at this genuinely didn't like women, or they got some catharsis out of the homophobia, misogyny in the film, or they were very, very young and didn't know what a joke was. And I think the most frustrating thing about it is that I watched Gavin and Stacey in preparation for this podcast because I'd never seen it before, and both James Corden and Matthew Horn are funny, and it's very clear they have, like, at least at the time, they had like a good relationship, they had good chemistry on screen. So the fact that it just doesn't translate in this film puts it more down to like a series of incompetencies across the board. Now, I don't know what went on behind the scenes. I've only heard like interviews and stuff, but everything seemed to go as planned according to the director, according to the actors when they signed on for it. So for some reason, this just like passed everyone's test on what was good comedy. And I think that the climate of comedy at that time does add a lot of explanations for it. And researching around that time has been really interesting because I think I've come to some conclusions that they have been hit on marginally, but haven't been hit on in detail, I don't think. And I want to get into that on this episode. But what I'm going to do, because I've already spoken for quite a while at this point, I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen this film, don't watch it because it's not good. But if for some reason you care about the details of this film and feel like me talking about it in detail is going to spoil it for you, then you should go away and watch the film yourself. I say this incredibly cautiously. I mean, actually, what you could do is just read the Wikipedia page because I do not recommend sitting through this. I sat through it twice so I could make notes on it for this podcast because I hadn't seen it since I was like 13. I watched it on Tubi and it was genuinely unbearable both times I did. So take that as a recommendation if you want.
What are we gonna do now?
Steaks. Lots of sharp steaks. Armour says with anything that we can plunge straight through their hell whore hearts.
Again, great idea, like it. Plunging, sharp objects, hell whore hearts. Let's fucking have it!
I think what I want to do first is talk about the horror comedy and what it's made up of, why people think that it's like an easy genre to take a stab at, because many people really fail at both of these genres combined. So as a subgenre, I find that it is very much maligned by horror fans and by comedy fans. And it's not hard to see why, because if you're not funny and you're not disturbing or scary, then you just made a genre set piece that is obsessed with its own tropes, but has nothing of note to really say about them. First, though, I do want to give Phil Claydon, who at this point, I know more about Phil Claydon than anyone else does for some reason. I listened to just like a bunch of podcasts and I read a lot of his interviews. And from what I can tell, he's a nice enough person. He seems to really like making films. He likes talking about films. He's very passionate about films. I will say this, I do think to a certain extent there is a pretty firm grasp on horror as a genre. Like if you were to ask me if I believed that there was a firm grasp on what horror is for, as in decoding the specific neuroses of a time period or of a group of people, in this case it would be young British men, then I do think that the film does capture a certain insecurity in men that they are becoming obsolete and must reassert themselves as men in order to tamp down the growing scourge of feminism that wants to take away their access to women's bodies. I would say, as a movie, it has a firm grasp on that, and I think the set piece of the cabin in the woods and the fog and the scantily clad women floating through the air, kissing each other. In my somewhat brief excursions into Hammer horror, which has been a clear inspiration for this film, I can't say that it did a bad job. And I'm going to read some interviews from Phil Claydon, both from Den of Geek and movies.ie. I grew up watching movies. Staying up late to watch a Hammer film was great. For one thing, they weren't very scary, but on the other hand, they took you into this world. I loved the theatricality of it and the theatricality of the extreme red blood. I remember sitting down watching the horror of Dracula and the first Terence Fisher movies. It was really fast-paced storytelling. Lesbian Vampire Killers isn't full-on horror. It's more a comedy. We're more like Ghostbusters with added lesbian vampires. You had 80 minutes, you're in, you're out. It was great fun, and they didn't drag it on at all because they would have been out of time or budget to finish it. A good question to ask, with all that in mind, is what does comedy exist for in the horror genre? Because I think for the most part it functions to bring a sense of irony to what is happening. So if you look at horror as a genre, it does require a somewhat serious tone where if you are to immerse the audience within it, then you as a filmmaker have to bring that immersion, bring that sense of fear and shock and disturbing imagery, because to a certain extent, a lot of horror relies on a heightened sense of the fantastic. So stuff that wouldn't typically be believable if you were going for straight realism. A lot of the time, and I'm more talking about classic horror here because I think realism in horror has become more and more of a trend, whereas the out-of-body, fantastical, otherworldly has been more of a classical, traditional type of thing. So it would have relied more on the monster. When you're talking about comedy, a lot of comedy, when it's blended with horror, is there to point at certain tropes and say, why is that? Why does that exist? What's that for? So it could be subversion, it could be pointing at the thing and being like, that's weird and bad, isn't that weird? Isn't it weird we're in a horror movie right now? And I think this movie relies more on the latter. And I think because obviously this came out in 2009, so it doesn't have the benefit of aging well, because I feel as though better horror comedies have come out, but it was also massive amounts of irony where everyone is very self-aware about everything, and simply gesturing at a trope is not going to be enough to get laughs. So I'd say that the other part of the comedy in this film is just straight up bigotry. It is the characters saying slurs or swearing. It is the vampires in the movie, after being killed, exploding into semen. Yes, that is a real thing in the movie. It is pointing at your ex-girlfriend who broke up with you and cheated on you, and after killing her with an axe, saying that she was a bitch anyway and that she deserved to die. Again, another real thing in the movie. So when this film is not balancing the cheap gesturing at, oh my god, isn't it weird that we have to be in a horror movie right now? I'm not equipped to be in a horror movie right now. I shouldn't have to be in a horror movie right now. When it's not that, it is relying very much on me finding it funny that women are being violently murdered specifically for their sexuality. I can't stress enough, that's wholly what this film relies on. You might have been screaming at me through your phone or however you're listening to this, but Amber, the horror films of the past, especially Hammer horror, have been as homophobic and misogynistic as this film. And I would say to you that you're very correct, actually, that murdered women, homophobia, the other being coded as a marginalized group, is very common in the horror genre. When you have a dominant group talking about what they fear the most, marginalized people are going to feature in those movies, and they're often going to be the villains of them. And you'd be correct for that observation. Well done, you. What I'm going to swoop in and say is that many of those horror films approach these subjects with a complete sincerity and a seriousness. And that's not to say that it's less bigoted because of that, but it is not attempting to make me laugh at the deaths of these people. I think in its seriousness, at times, a queer reading of these films can actually evoke a moroseness, a kind of sadness around the death of this other figure. If I think of a film like The Vampire Lovers, which is the first film in the Karnstein trilogy. It's basically a retelling of the short story Carmilla. Now, again, this film is still homophobic. It codes lesbian identity as like a violent, blood-sucking, parasitic thing that will attach itself to your daughters and turn them gay. However, because the film is like intensely interested in this subject, it, either by accident or on purpose, gives Carmilla a certain amount of pathos where we are able to at least see how she also struggles with this world and what she is, how her desires have kind of come at odds with her actually getting to pursue a loving relationship where it becomes compulsive rather than a choice. Again, not homophobic, but interesting in terms of analysis, where the comedy in this film could have been used to undercut or highlight the homophobia of these movies. What it does instead is exploit it to be laughed at. There is nothing here that could possibly be reclaimed, I don't believe. I think any attempts to do so would fail because the women in this film aren't people. They are wholly objects, that there is nothing to subjectify at all because their characterization is paper thin. They are heightened to the extent that they only exist to be brainless, to be cruel and mean, to be actively trying to murder you. There is nothing more beyond that. I think you could make the argument that films like those that have come from like Dracula or Frankenstein, those have come from texts that have very sincerely been invested in these kind of topics, whereas making jokes about how you've gone on a lad's holiday where every single woman is gay and doesn't want to have sex with you is not the interesting analysis that could have been done with this movie. But like I said, it's written by people who don't really like women and don't personify women, so there is nothing to grasp onto, not very funny a lot of the time. So what we have is just a kind of bland and spiteful movie that is also deeply insecure about where horror kind of fits in terms of the like masculine identity, because in a sense this film existed to somewhat revive the Hammer horror but with a self-aware twist. Now, what I learned from my research is that Hammer fully did not want to produce this film. Good choice, in my opinion. The attempts to revive or subvert or discuss the tropes of horror and point at the absurdity of them. There's no skill to the language of the film, number one, but two, it smacks of insecurity that there's this sense that a film like this cannot exist anymore, and as a result the film itself spins its wheels trying to find something to grab onto, and what it does is replication with no real insight. You have like a bland set piece that is just running out the clock because it knows that there's certain things that it has to hit in order to be considered a Hammer horror film. Because it has no desire to deconstruct the inherent masculine heteronormativity of these films, it's just, there's no other way to put it, it's just masturbatory. It's just like, look at this, look at that, look at these, here's another slow motion shot of women being half naked. Don't you want to see that again? And there's no meat to it. I think that's what I've come away with. Stephanie Crawford wrote a piece called The Plagues and Pleasures of Horror Comedy, where she says that part of the issue is that as both genres and human conditions, horror and comedy give off the misconception that they are easy to interpret and render without much effort. It's easier to mime than it is to mine when it comes to digging into why things make people react the way they do. And that always bears out when it comes time to portray those reactions on screen. If you are going to get any enjoyment out of it, it would only be enjoyable if you already understood and were ready to make fun of the fact that a vampire horror film exists at all. And I do want to point out that the first Twilight film had already come out at this point, and I think it's not the whole reason why it exists, but it would definitely explain why it was out in the air and ready for people to watch. And if you were to get enjoyment from it, it would have to be from a like ironic and somewhat hateful place, as in you're not someone who actually enjoys horror, you're just quite disdainful towards horror and want to see it picked apart in this really bland way. If I am to give it credit, I'm not going to when I don't have to, it does draw on the tradition of blood and sex being associated with one another. Whatever praise I could possibly give towards it, it would be meager, because this is not something that is really done anything with. Is that a sentence? In the film, what is needed to resurrect Carmilla is the blood of the ancestor who killed her, and also a virgin's blood, which, if you didn't know, was how she was resurrected in the Karnstein trilogy, at least. I'm not sure about the short story. I suppose it's this idea that in order for Carmilla to exist again, she must take what is good and pure, what could possibly defeat her, and drain it of life so that she can exist again. So it would be the person who killed her first, and also someone who is, for all intents and purposes, pure and virtuous, and it's like draining the good from the world in order to be alive. And if that isn't the most homophobic shit you ever heard, then I don't know what is. And once again, the homophobia in the film existing is not necessarily an issue in and of itself, because I've watched as homophobic stuff and been still somewhat impressed with it as a set piece. But if you are going to retell the Carmilla story, the only possible way that has been thought of to translate it to the modern world, as in the world of 2009, is simply transplanting this story onto two men who have been emasculated by the women in their lives and who now need a self-esteem boost. In Elizabeth Signorotti's Repossessing the Body, Transgressive Desire in Carmilla and Dracula, she posits that Le Fanu's creation of a woman vampire anticipates the shift towards the end of the century to predominantly female vampires. In both art and literature, women, and specifically women's bodies, became progressively associated with the vampire. Now, why might this be? As gender dynamics shift, as a result, the structure of power shifts, and women no longer being associated with a patriarchal bloodline becomes an issue if you are trying to maintain a hierarchy. If women can go out and, for example, swap blood with anyone regardless of gender, what does it mean for the stability of the world? How do men exist in this kind of world? And once again, the specific neuroses of men in horror is always very fascinating, and the way it's explored is probably more fascinating, because the fact that these two men feel the desire to remasculinize themselves, albeit reluctantly in the film. They are very, very, very reluctant to be the heroes. In fact, both of them are quite happy to just leave the film and leave everyone around them to die, which, you know, I suppose is meant to be funny. The reluctant hero has a plausible deniability of violently murdering women that they know to reaffirm themselves. I would say if this were a self-aware horror, it would not have the triumphant ending that it seems to lean towards, that it would look at the bloodshed of the film and be like, what have we had to do in order to preserve our sense of selves? And at the end of the day, is it worth it? Now that would take some good writing, I think, that just isn't there in the film. Instead, we are kind of bombarded with tropes that give like the air that something genuinely ironic is being done. The priest with the virginal daughter, the cabin in the woods with fog pouring from the roof, and we have a kind of positioned as ironic but really not ironic hero's journey where the evils of lesbianism are killed off and the not like other girls woman is in love with you now, and you never have to bow down to the desires of domineering women ever again because you have these skills now where you can just reassert your dominance over them. I think I'm going to end this section with a potentially controversial statement. And I promise you, so no one panic, all right? Because I'm not going to suddenly start defending this film. Jesus Christ. To put myself in like a straw man position, I think sometimes when approaching these films in a critical way, by that I mean overly negative way, there is this assumption that I do not enjoy comedy at all, that I wouldn't be able to take a joke if it was presented to me, and that is the simple fact that it is homophobic and misogynistic, which it is, that is like stopping me from laughing at this film. What is left when you take away those things is the somewhat tenuous friendship between two men who I know can portray friendship on screen, but really, really struggle in this film too for some reason. And also a lot of like fat jokes at the expense of James Corden, and two men just being very, very horny. And I do want to stress that pointing out that lowbrow art is lowbrow is not especially interesting for me in particular. I personally do not have a problem with jokes about cum, with jokes about sex, with fart jokes. Gross out humor is actually something I quite enjoy. I think it does provide a sense of like levity to a film. I think joking about the body and bodily functions is fun and fine and is interesting when it's done well. I also don't necessarily agree with positions that just point out that it is essentially just a genre piece or a parody of one. If you're someone that doesn't like horror and you came away from this movie being like, well, I didn't like horror, so I didn't like this, that's not an especially interesting position to come from either. A genre piece containing tropes in and of itself is not the flaw here. It would be the filmmakers not knowing why they're interesting or what's funny about them. The reviews that I've read really seemed to not enjoy that it wasn't something more heightened. And I don't necessarily believe that everything has to be this heightened thing. Though I do believe to a certain extent that's what it was trying to be. It just never quite got there. It never felt like it even managed to tie its shoes, never mind go for the sprint of genuinely deconstructing horror. I do think it was just a case that they wanted to make a horny, gross horror film with a lot of violence in it. I don't personally think that being crass or silly or ironic on their own is a crime. And I know it might seem like I'm like a massive buzzkill, and I am in a lot of ways. But when it comes to things being lowbrow, low art, silly, disgusting, overly sexual, I don't take issue with any of those things. If any of those things made this movie funny or scary at all, then I might actually be impressed with them. I think being a horror comedy that isn't funny or scary is a massive issue because it fails to understand the purpose of doing this kind of genre piece in the first place.
You're such a fucking ponce, James. Which one do you fancy? Which one do you like the most? Just answer the question.
All right then, Lottie. She seems really nice and friendly. And it's like she's got this pure spirit. She's just really sweet. She's got the prettiest eyes. It's like looking into bottomless pools. And you?
Trudy. Massive tits, never speaks.
This next section is going to be a big one because I have to talk about late 2000s misogyny and how that is linked to a lot of the popularity of British comedy around that time. So cast your minds back to 2009. This was the year that the Hangover came out, and also the Human Centipede came out. And you might be like, why am I linking those two films together? Because they were both viral hits, specifically because of their shocking and bawdy content. And they did seem to encapsulate a kind of need for something very transgressive, but more importantly, something very masculine. And this is the kind of setting for this film, Lesbian Vampire Killers, to be released into. The film was produced and released in between season 2 and season 3 of Gavin and Stacey. They were really riding high on the charisma and chemistry of Matthew Horn and James Corden, and there was a big push to make them a thing in the British comedy scene. Comedy duos in general have some kind of mileage, I think depending on who you ask. So in terms of British comedy duos, let's see how many I can name. Morecambe, Wise, French and Saunders, Mitchell and Webb. There are more, I wish I could think of them, but those are just like a few examples. So there was a push to kind of make these two men a thing as a British comedy duo. They had a comedy sketch show that came out the same week of the film called Horn and Corden, and they also hosted the Brit Awards around this time. So they were very booked and busy. They had a lot on, and there did seem to be this kind of manufacturing of an iconic duo that you could reel off at the top of your head. As you might have guessed, this film did not do them any favours, and from what I've read, neither did the sketch comedy show. I watched a few clips from it on YouTube. I was considering trying to watch the whole thing front to back, but the only way I could find it was a DVD of it on eBay, and I thought to myself, is this something I want to own? And the conclusion I came to was no. But I have read other people's reviews from it, and it was kind of universally panned, and from the clips that I saw, I can kind of see why. It's not a show that had like a rhythm to it or any real charisma. It's a similar problem to the movie, if we're being honest. It's bad writing. It feels like comedy that these two men are just not used to doing, and that makes a lot of sense. In Gavin and Stacey, Matthew Horn plays like the straight man who will occasionally have a good line, but he mostly reacts to James Corden's character, who is slightly more abrasive, but they both end up coming off as affable, and there's this genuine chemistry of friendship that just didn't really resonate into either the sketch show or this movie. I just want to quote this article that I found written by Fergal Kinney titled Gavin and Stacey, the sitcom New Labour Built, where he says, British comedy had never been nastier in the noughties, where gross out humour matched shocking cruelty in hits like Little Britain and Beau Selector. Gavin and Stacey was an unusually affable slice of low-stakes life, with gags as broad as the multi-generational unit contained within the show. My analysis is that this was just not a good fit for either of these actors, and it's specifically because of its mean-spiritedness that I think it really does rub the wrong way. I think because neither James Corden or Matthew Horn can really pull off these characters. And it's not just because they are massively underwritten, but because they, I guess, require a kind of effortlessness that just doesn't really come through. none of this is helped by the fact that they don't really have that much to work with. Not to rub salt in the wound, but a review from around the time that it came out, posted by Screen Daily, did say that the film was littered with the broken dreams of popular television comedians who failed to make the transition to the big screen. And it is this kind of really cynical, also somewhat tragic trajectory where people behind the scenes feel as though they need to cash in on someone's popularity, but instead of investing in stuff that would show off their strengths, they just do the big push for the typical kind of things, you know. So people host award shows, or they get a television show, or they act in a movie. Sometimes they'll record an album. I suppose like more modern examples would be making a TikTok account. I, for some reason, sound very old when I say that. And I'm only in my mid-20s. It is this very like cynical push for everything, and it's coming from people who don't really understand or learn from the mistakes of the past, that if you oversaturate an audience with someone, people will get annoyed simply because they feel as though they've seen them too much. Overexposure really is the killer of people's careers, but also like people's mental health, because having to experience like the weight of criticism in like such a large amount is kind of detrimental, and it's unsurprising that people just back away and do not want to engage anymore. I've talked a lot about the actors. Let's talk a little bit about the writers. Paul Hupfield and Stuart Williams both have backgrounds in sketch comedy writing, writing for panel shows, and they were former MTV comedy writers. All of that to say, there is a kind of combativeness, a childishness, and a mean-spirited aura to the kind of comedy that they're used to writing, and I suppose permeates the script of this film. It's the kind of comedy that is meant to be watched very late at night on like BBC Three or something, even though I don't think that exists as a channel anymore. And you watch it with the volume turned all the way down. One of the shows that they wrote for was called Balls of Steel, and it's kind of a Jackass knockoff. It's a lot worse because a lot of it kind of mostly seemed to be bothering people who worked in customer service. There was a sketch that I watched on YouTube. Once again, I could not find full episodes of the show, and I didn't really want to watch it either. But one of the pranks, I guess, was throwing a bucket of shit on a window that someone was cleaning, and then getting surprised when people wanted to punch you in the face after you did that. Sam Wollaston for The Guardian wrote about Balls of Steel that it was Friday night televisual kebabs and not to be watched with tea and biscuits and granny on a Sunday afternoon. So there is a kind of context in which shows like these, Bo Selector, Phone Jacker, the Kevin Bishop Show, Ali G, Balls of Steel, there is a context in which they are enjoyable and a specific audience that they're trying to court. Similar to what the audience of this film would be, it is people who are awake at 3 a.m, I guess, and very hungover, or more specifically, teenage boys. That's who we're trying to appeal to here. And to a certain extent, it makes me really sad, because siphoning off of demographics into separating people by gender and age and class background to sell them things is gross and weird, but also it asks so little of teenage boys, and I wish they had better stuff to watch, really. And it is kind of interesting, I guess, because from the reviews that I read, a lot of the men who were meant to be the target audience of this film didn't like it either. There's a lot of them that just seem to fully reject it, which I suppose is that progress for the time? Was there a big push to be like, this is bad? There was a sense that it was courting an audience that would be interested in giggling along in the safety of their own homes to misogynistic jokes if there was the kind of caliber of writing of a film like Shaun of the Dead. And I know that Phil Clayton has like refuted the claim that that's what this film was for, like it was trying to be like Shaun of the Dead, and it just didn't get there. But it does make sense, I suppose, when the only real frame of reference of a horror comedy that people like is Shaun of the Dead, and it's also like a very popular British comedy with another British comedy duo, so it does make sense. Now that I've kind of talked about the context of British comedy around this time, we do also need to kind of talk about what this kind of film emulates in terms of British misogyny in general. We're going to talk about lad culture, a kind of cursory definition of lad culture according to the National Union of Students. It says that it refers to a group or pack mentality residing in activities such as sports, heavy alcohol consumption, and banter, which is often sexist, misogynistic, racist, or homophobic. It is also thought to be a sexualized culture which involves the objectification of women and rape-supportive attitudes, and occasionally spilling over into sexual harassment and violence. That is like a lot to put on this movie, but the kind of context, I suppose, is there is this shared camaraderie in what is expected of men, where if you can't I suppose relate to another man on a intellectual level or through a shared hobby, you can at least relate to him on your domination over marginalized people. More specifically, within the case of this movie, it would be women, right? So you can elbow each other and be like, oh my god, that reminds me of your ex-girlfriend. Again, I would I would pass with flying colours amongst men. This is exactly how they talk. But I suppose what I mean is that there's this shared idea, this kind of insular space where men can be misogynistic and have it be a sort of like dog whistle that they're okay to talk about the stuff with, that they're like cool and they don't get easily offended, and it's kind of testing the boundaries of what is and is not acceptable. So I suppose like political incorrectness is associated with young men as well. It's this kind of pushing of boundaries to assert that you are like cool and can take a joke. And I think that is the kind of mentality that this film is coming from. It would be a mistake to argue that the two main characters' lack of masculinity is a detriment to this, when in fact is the film covers their remasculinization. If they're able to brutally murder these vampires who are trying to corrupt the sexy women that they want to have sex with, then it proves to themselves, it proves to the men in the audience that nothing has changed, that despite these evil monsters returning from the dead, everything can go back to what it used to be, which is that men were men and they did man things. And this only really makes sense if at the beginning of the movie both men are being emasculated by the women in their lives. So for Jimmy, his ex-girlfriend Judy was repeatedly cheating on him and breaks up with him constantly and is also just really annoying and a bitch, as the film says. She only comes back to him once she is being rejected by her married boyfriend. She eventually becomes a vampire and is killed by Fletcher and Jimmy, and they get to tell her off after she's been murdered. She gets axed in the head and then called a bitch. Hooray, we are meant to cheer. Fletcher similarly is an undersexed, overweight man, his own words, not mine, who has recently lost his job after punching a child in the face, and he is dressed down by his boss, who is only known as Mrs. Rossi. She's only in like 2 minutes of the film. It's a scene that mostly feels pointless and isn't very funny, but it is meant to emphasize that these are like two men who are in need of women who are not going to make them feel lesser. And it's not this kind of complex exploration of abuse or anything. It is this very cynical, one-dimensional depiction of women who are bitches and then women who are nice and are not going to talk back to you, and what it is you can do to maintain the hierarchy that is needed to make women submit to you. It's not necessarily presented in a way that is meant to feel nefarious. I am obviously a paranoid lunatic, and I don't mind giving deep analysis of films that aren't meant to be taken that seriously. However, it is, I suppose, disturbing to me that this film really isn't very funny. So the spaces that are left in the film for me to laugh at, especially those moments where women are getting very brutally murdered, I do feel just an intense concern towards what it is that I'm meant to be experiencing watching this film as a woman, as someone who has experienced like misogyny before. What would I, watching this film, get from it? And I don't have to be the audience for every film. This film feels written for only really one type of person, and it's a very angry, disgruntled man who wants to let off steam by watching a load of misogyny. And I suppose films like that can exist, but when you call your film Lesbian Vampire Killers, you invite the lesbians to have an opinion on it. I found this really good quote about the film from Ian Hunter's book, British Trash Cinema, where he says, "For all the film's parody of machismo and hopelessness of the modern male, there is also a distinct element of vengeful wish fulfillment by men adrift in a feminized world. If anything, Lesbian Vampire Killers is more reactionary than Hammer's fantasies of dangerously sexy women. The film's trashiness, which supposedly inoculates it against sexism by ironizing masculinity, enables it to celebrate rather than subvert the stereotypes it so knowingly pastiches." I do need to talk about the camera. Did you know that the male gaze exists? What? Oh my god. And at a certain point, especially in my like movie watching adventures, at a certain point, the male gaze as like a formalist principle is just very distracting, and I get genuinely bored at like montages of panning up and down women's bodies, of slow motion shots of upskirting, just watching men stare at women. Like, you've halted the entire film so I can not be entertained, so that this movie has to keep going for some reason, to stare at these women who you've dressed in tiny shorts and low-cut tops. No disrespect to wearing that, but it feels almost aesthetically generated to specifically appeal to like a 13-year-old boy who has never spoken to a woman or knows what adult women wear, especially if they're hiking out in the countryside. And honestly, if this felt like a heightened piece of comedy where the, I suppose, misogyny feels weird and absurd, then I could maybe hold some concessions there. This kind of filmmaking, not only does it not speak to the horror genre really, it is entirely aligned with the shitty comedy as it exists in and of itself. The parody / the comedy does not extend beyond the self-reflexiveness of it. Unfortunately, this kind of self-awareness does not translate to any other element of the movie, which means when the film stops so that we as an audience can stare at a woman's ass as she's walking to the bathroom, I'm left just like, how how is it that women do not get to make movies? I don't understand. This passed the test. This got made. People funded this. People were okay with this existing. And to quote a really good Lindsay Ellis video where she spoke about how Megan Fox was framed in the Transformers movies, there is an incongruence between how the women are being written versus how they're shot. And they're not there to be characters who grow and change over the course of the narrative, but they're there to be gratuitous eye candy. And this dissonance of framing, and I'm guilty of this myself, it causes the audience to remember the characters differently than how they maybe are. And that's not to say that the characters in this movie are like secretly really complex, but that the writing in combination with the filmmaking stifles any kind of meaningful praise I could give to the representation of women in this film. Because there is one single female character with agency, and she only really exists, I guess, to be antithetical to her group of friends who are going to be eaten by vampires. She is in the wrong movie, really. In an entirely different movie, she would be the final girl. And I read from like interviews that she was meant to be like a Buffy insert, I guess. And that is kind of as far as the character extends. She's there to be antithetical to the two main characters who have no clue what the hell is going on. As women in this movie, you can be gawked at, or you can be so intelligent and beautiful that you become this kind of hyper strong being who no longer becomes a person. The cherry on top of this is the obsession the film has with virginity. Now, in and of itself, that's not a problem, because vampire movies in general are obsessed with virginity and racial purity and the purity of women and stuff. But it's introduced not as a comment on women's sexuality and the suppression of it, but as what is literally meant to be appealing about them. So both Lottie and the priest's daughter are meant to be virgins in the film. And as the film makes repeatedly clear, on top of how old they both are, this does ironically sexualize them. It puts them in a sexualized position, which is horrific, and I hate it. Bringing it up in and of itself could have been an interesting thing for the film to comment on, and it just doesn't, because it is also seriously invested in sexualizing both of these women and not criticizing the main characters, because the main characters are the audience analog, and if you criticize the audience analog, then the audience turns the movie off, which they probably would have already done. How many people are watching this movie more than once, bar me, because I'm an insane person? I guess the point that I wanted to make is that whether we like it or not, this film is actually very indicative of the kind of British comedy that was popular around this period of time. And as I've established, it was very much banking on the star power and the charisma of its lead actors, who just didn't provide it. As a result, I think it kind of, I wouldn't say it marked the end of this period of time, but I think as the decade went on, and as like governments changed and the way people watch TV and movies changed, this kind of straight to DVD movie couldn't really exist anymore. And this kind of comedy aged out, not because things became less misogynistic or people found it less offensive, but because it kind of encapsulated the period of time in a way that I guess exposed its flaws to a mainstream audience. Comedy ages poorly, not necessarily because it is offensive, but because stuff like this becomes just less topical. And I think to a certain extent, it's a film that feels very reactionary to what would have been incredibly meager feminist actions to criticize stuff like misogyny, the type of objectification that would be in lads mags and, you know, the kind of TV shows that I was talking about. And I do want to emphasize these were meager efforts, and you can see the kind of extreme reaction people have when anything they enjoy is criticized. And I think films like these, they don't have a lot of staying power specifically because they're reactionary. And when you make something like this, it does garner a lot of heavy criticism. With that in mind, I am going to go on a tangent about James Corden. So In 2013, when giving an interview with The Guardian, he was asked what was his most embarrassing moment, and he said, Lesbian Vampire Killers. And as someone who watched A League of Their Own and was fairly aware of James Corden, I knew that this was a movie that he had rejected once it came out. Now, if you go back and you read interviews with Phil Clayton, if you watch the on-set video with Empire magazine and other interviews, there is the sense that this was a movie that he was really championing. He was attached pre-Gavin and Stacey. He was cited as an ambassador for the project. He's quoted to say that he was excited to get chased around by hot girls in the woods, and he said he found it really funny, and he said that he would be sad if it was a film that wouldn't get to be made. And then post Lesbian Vampire Killers, he had changed his tune. So he was quoted saying that it felt shit at the time, that he knew whilst he was making it that he wasn't very good, and that Phil Clayton, the director of the film, commented that he believed that James Corden was distancing himself from the project because of its failure, and because as time went on, James Corden just got bigger and bigger, he became a more public figure, it had to be something that he distanced himself from. And I think when you hear a story like this of someone being very enthusiastic about something and then very suddenly changing their opinion once it goes tits up, there is this compulsion to frame this person as duplicitous and fake. And I think James Corden has had a lot of criticism about his personality and his demeanour and the way he treats people, some of which is valid, others I would disagree with. It's kind of that thing of that thing that I was saying before, that I think James Corden has experienced multiple waves of, which is just being overexposed. So it's that period in between season 2 and season 3 of Gavin and Stacey, a lot of James Corden and Matthew Horn all the time, everywhere, which caused a lot of backlash, and as a result, James Corden pulled back and didn't want to be associated with it anymore. There's a similar period, late 2010s, early 2020s, where James Corden was the host of a late night talk show. He was everywhere also at the time. He was in a lot of movies as well. And there was a similar amount of backlash. And I think just as someone who has zero reason to be invested in any of this and who does not feel the need to defend James Corden for really anything, because I don't know him and I only really sometimes like the stuff he's been in. I want to, I suppose, make the defense of, as a person being exposed to a massive amount of criticism, it does make sense in my head to no longer want to be associated with the period of time where I was being criticised a lot. James Corden, as a fat person in the public eye, being very heavily criticised all the time, especially if you're getting a lot of criticism. I say criticism, massive amounts of hatred, much of which is insulting your appearance and your voice and who you are all the time. There is only so far you can be prepared for that. And James Corden has said that this period of time where this movie was coming out was an incredibly high stress time, and it put a massive strain on the relationship he had with Matthew Horn, specifically because it was just failure after failure after failure. There's only so much that can be taken from that. Whilst in general, I believe that you should stand behind the stuff that you make and not shit talk it because you're insecure about it. It's not an action that I'm going to criticize that much. I think it feels understandable. I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying it's very conflict avoidant, but also I don't believe most of us know what it feels like to be criticized to that much of a degree, and that wanting to remove yourself from the vitriol aimed at you by disavowing a movie is understandable, if kind of cowardly. And like I said, I don't have any stakes in this. I don't particularly like James Corden really that much, but I also feel as though some people mistake finding someone very annoying as like a justification to find stuff to hate about people. And whilst I do genuinely believe a lot of the criticism of Lesbian Vampire Killers is valid, I don't necessarily support holding a special place in your heart to hate a particular celebrity, because if we're being honest, Matthew Horn is also really bad in this film. And James Corden just received the brunt of the criticism, I think. I keep saying this, but specifically because he was a fat person. There really isn't any other way around it. I don't believe that if he was thinner, then he would have received as much criticism about what he looked like with regards to the quality of this film. Once again, I'll say it another time, I don't have a reason to defend James Corden, especially because this movie is terrible. I do also believe it has become firmly attached to his character, and he keeps getting asked about it, specifically because of how overexposed he was. In my opinion, this can all be attributed to the kind of corporate underbelly of the British comedy scene, and how it's not this kind of scrappy little movement that it kind of makes itself out to be, that the BBC kind of pushes its strongest warriors to the brink and doesn't really have a safety net for when they fail publicly.
Lesbian vampires.
How ridiculous.
No, just another one of God's cruel tricks to get on my tits. Even dead women would sooner sleep with each other than get with me, it would appear. But eating me alive? Oh no, that's fine.
Lesbian vampires.
Next time, he'll have me bummed by a big gay werewolf, I swear.
As this is a podcast that covers LGBT topics, I should probably talk about how the film represents the lesbians of the Lesbian Vampire Killers. What it is worth pointing out is that any kind of semi-mainstream representation is going to highlight the lack of representation on screen. And that might seem like a nothing statement, but in the UK, representation of lesbians is quite sparse on screen. When I was looking for like historical British cinema about lesbians, I came across quite a few documentaries and a lot of films about gay men, but we have just a distinct lack of lesbians on screen, which is not entirely surprising. If you look at the history of the UK, it has obviously, like in many countries, been illegal for a very long time. The Sexual Offences Act very much did cover homosexuality. However, it did not legislate the decriminalisation of female homosexuality, specifically because it's one of those things that was kind of just rumoured to not really exist. So Adam Vaughan, in an article for The Conversation, argued that it could stem from the kind of Queen Victoria quote that lesbians didn't really exist. It's this kind of idea that women as like separate entities from men don't really exist in a public way, and that has kind of trickled down to how they come to be represented on screen. British cinema itself is massively underfunded and quite sparse, I suppose, in comparison to something like American cinema, which seems ever present. To be fair, it's quite hard to compete with America. The input and the amount of money that is like pumped into the film industry makes it so that they can produce more cinema. But it is still significant that there is just this imbalance. The point that I'm coming to is that this film is one of the most well-known examples, and on IMDb, the word lesbian doesn't even really appear in the title. It's just called Vampire Killers. You're getting the idea that lesbian identity is simultaneously incredibly exploitable and sexualized, but also not safe to be mentioned in the actual title of the film, despite the fact that that is the entire appeal of the title in the first place. The interesting thing is that the film itself exists as a one giant gay panic narrative where these two men are obsessed with women's bodies and sexualizing them. And there's this secret obsession with the idea of women having sex with each other. And all of this is like an overextension of their heterosexuality, which they have to repeatedly emphasize by stating out loud, for a lot of the time, no reason, that they're not gay. There's this threat of sexual assault of, I think it's Fletcher who says, "I'm not going to bum you or anything," when he suggests that they go on holiday together. There's this idea that these two men who are allegedly friends, if they were to go on holiday together alone, it may be insinuated that they could be in a relationship with one another. And this has to be yelled out loud so that nobody thinks that, even though that wasn't ever going to be the assumption. And two, if it was, why would they care so much? And the answer to that question is, this script was written in 2007 and homophobia amongst young men was funny. Calling things gay as an insult was funny. And panicking in a jokey way that your friend is gonna rape you, or you're going to get raped if you go into a pub with a group of men, or you're gonna get bummed by a big gay werewolf. It's all posturing, and it's meant to be funny at the expense of gayness itself. So the two sides of the coin in representing queerness in this film are the lesbians, who are this distanced, monstrous entity who are trying to usurp the rightful power of men by having a bunch of sex and doing a bunch of murder. Then you have the other side, the gay male side, where homosexuality is a distinct threat to one's own identity. If I was younger, or maybe had thinner skin, or hadn't watched so many movies, I may even be offended by this, but this film has so little at stake, is so low energy, that I honestly think it would take more time out of my day to be offended by this. What I can say is it does feel very indicative of a period of time where there was just a lot of male-dominated media for men. I'm thinking, like, you know, this was the period of Michael Bay's Transformers. If you were a British teenager, this was when The In-Betweeners was on TV. And I think those two entities, they might seem very different, but they both kind of exploit the objectification of women and the fear of being perceived as gay for fun, profit, and comedy. We're meant to be laughing at the fact that being gay could even be a legitimate thing. It has to be this monstrous externalized force that you distance yourself from. It's not something that could ever be grounded in reality. And the fact that anyone would want to tell a story like this with a legitimate interest in queerness, that itself is presented as absurd. I'm about to do potentially the unthinkable and give this movie a compliment. And my compliment is that I really enjoyed the scene where Carmilla was resurrected, and it had next to nothing to do with the intentions of the film and everything to do with the actors. In this scene, Jimmy's blood has been mixed with Lottie's blood, and Carmilla is raised from the dead and reunited with her grieving lover who has brought her back to life, and they share a really passionate kiss. And I want to say that the actress who plays Carmilla is really good in this film. She has very little to work with. She's hardly on screen, but she is very good. They resurrect and they kiss each other really passionately. It causes all the other vampires to kiss each other passionately. I do think in a better movie, this reunion would have evoked something really emotional in me. Like I said, if I was made to give a fuck about these characters, then I would have liked this scene. I think it's a good one. I think raising your lover back from the dead using the blood of some guy is really romantic. And like I said, in a better movie, this would have been insane. And thinking about it makes me sad because that movie just doesn't exist. And it should be a happy moment, you know? I'm rooting I'm rooting for the lesbian vampires, I'm gonna be honest. Unfortunately, they don't win. The second possibly good thing, though, I'll talk about it and see, is that once Carmilla is dead and the curse is broken, in a fight scene that just goes on way too long, everyone's just running around manic in the woods and you can't tell where anyone is. There is no sense of rhythm with these fights, and I didn't care for the exploding into ejaculate, really. I think it was meant to be funny, but it wasn't. Regardless, once the head vampire is dead and all the women have their vampire curse broken, which I don't believe was a good choice, but whatever. They stop being vampires, but they keep being lesbians. A win. I guarantee you this was just a joke. In fact, it is actually stated as a joke at the expense of Fletcher, because he states multiple times that even dead women would rather sleep with each other than sleep with him, which is not really surprising. They were just gay the whole time. They were just gay. They just happened to also be vampires, and you know what? Good for them. If I wanted to, and I think I am going to, I could be really cynical and read this as a kind of we'll never escape from the homosexual curse. In Elizabeth Signorotti's article, she argues that in addition to the idea of literal contagion of blood, vampirism came to be linked to the notion of moral contagion, and essentially with the contamination of lesbianism. Because I believe this film is very genuinely reactionary and homophobic, we can interpret this ending, despite how cool I think it is, as the vampirism burrowing itself beneath the surface. And the fact that this film sets itself up for a sequel that it thankfully never got kind of adds to that there's this idea that even though the head vampire is gone, the vampirism, aka lesbianism, lays dormant for it to be awoken and made dangerous once more. So thinking about the potential sequel does give me psychic damage, but the fact that it doesn't exist is a win for everyone, and the fact that Fletcher ends up alone and miserable at the end is also a win. I think I personally have thought too much about this film, and I'm going to ask the question now on whether this film looks like a badger, aka, is it a bit shit? And the answer is that it's quite shit, actually. Its comedy relies on the idea that the two main characters are too emasculated to be a genuine hazard to women. The misogyny is meant to be softened by this fact, but it only highlights how pervasive violence against women is and how easily men find it funny. The depiction of lesbians only really exists to be titillating, and I think if it managed to come up with anything significant, beyond it being a threat to men, I may have had a strong reaction to it, but nothing about this film was unexpected, except for how boring it was. The lesson that we've learned is that if you watched a film when you were 12 years old on BBC 3 at like 1 a.m, that film, when you go back to watch it, will probably not be good. I'm going to give you some recommendations of films that are actually good. They're light-hearted as well. I've picked 2 comedies because I don't want people to think that I don't find things funny. Because even though I am annoying about movies, I do like to laugh at stuff too. The first recommendation is called Jesus Christ Vampire Hunter. Now, when you hear this title, you're going to be like, what the hell is that? Does that really exist? The answer is yes, and also it's a lot weirder than you think it's going to be. It's a very silly film about Jesus Christ saving lesbians from evil vampires. And it has a bunch of kung fu in it, and a weird guy that looks like Rasputin, and it's a lot of fun. More fun than this film is. The second film is a film that came out last year called Slay. I think it's a Tubi exclusive, which will give you an idea about what it will be like. It's about a group of drag queens who end up performing at a small town bar, and they end up being terrorized by vampires. A lot of fun, once again, a lot of fun, and low budget horror film made by gay people, made for gay people. I'm always going to support projects like that, so watch that one too. Thank you very much for listening. I will be back shortly with more bonus episodes, hopefully covering new releases this time, because I'm hoping to catch some gay films that come out in the cinema, because I didn't in January at all. And my next main episode will be in April. I think it's going to be a fun one. I'm hoping it's a fun one. It's a movie I haven't watched in a long time, and I'm worried it's going to be boring, but we'll see. If you'd like to stay updated, follow me on Twitter at @LikeABadgerPod. It's kind of a nightmare over there at the moment, but you can follow me there if you like. Make sure that you follow on Spotify and YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. I recently wrote a review for the movie Baby Girl, so go to my website ambercamwalk.com to read that. All of my sources are in the description. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Bye!